Jackson Airfield called it the graveyard shift, not because they worked nights, but because they worked on the dead. Rows of broken B-17 stretched across the coral hardstand in Port Moresby, their aluminum skins punctured by flak, their engines seized, their futures measured in spare parts for luckier aircraft. In the far corner of this mechanical cemetery sat a bomber that even the scavengers avoided. Tail number 41-2666. The ground crews had started calling it by a different name. Old 666, the number of the beast, the cursed ship. This particular flying fortress had earned its reputation through a string of disasters that defied probability. Its first crew had been killed, its second crew had crash-landed in the jungle, and its third crew had limped back from a mission so shot up that the flight surgeon found human teeth embedded in the radio compartment wall. Mechanics who worked on it reported tools going missing, instruments giving false readings, and an inexplicable feeling that the aircraft didn't want to fly. By early 1943, Old 666 had been officially condemned. Not destroyed, but abandoned. The brass stripped it for parts. The engines went to other bombers. The instruments went to other cockpits. The aircraft sat on its flat tires, nose drooping toward the crushed coral, waiting for someone to either resurrect it or push it into the ocean. Nobody volunteered for resurrection. You would have to be crazy to want this airplane. Jay Zeamer did not look like a hero. He was tall and lanky, with a face that seemed permanently arranged into an expression of mild amusement at some private joke. His uniform hung on his frame like it belonged to someone else. He walked with a loose, almost careless stride that made superior officers instinctively distrust him. The distrust was mutual. Zeamer had a problem with authority, specifically with authority that told him things couldn't be done. He had transferred between squadrons multiple times, not because he was incompetent, but because he kept volunteering for missions that weren't his to fly. He would show up at briefings for other crews, offer to fill empty seats, and disappear into combat zones where he had no official business. His service record was a mess of commendations and reprimands in equal measure. He was too good to court-martial and too difficult to promote, and the brass didn't know what to do with him, so they did nothing. They let him float through the 43rd Bomb Group like a ghost, flying whenever he could talk his way aboard, waiting for something to change. What changed was the boneyard. Zeamer walked past the rows of condemned aircraft one afternoon and stopped in front of Old 666. The mechanics watched him circle the broken bomber like a buyer at a used car lot. They waited for him to shake his head and walk away like everyone else. The request landed on the desk of the group commander like a dead fish. Captain Zeamer wanted to salvage 41-2666. He wanted engines, instruments, control surfaces, and ammunition. He wanted permission to rebuild a condemned aircraft that the entire maintenance division had declared unsalvageable. The commander's first instinct was to refuse. Resources were scarce. Every engine pulled from storage was an engine that could go to a functioning bomber. Every man-hour spent on a cursed wreck was an hour stolen from the war effort. The smart answer was no. But Zeamer had done his homework. He pointed out that Old 666's airframe was structurally sound. The crashes and disasters had killed crews but hadn't broken the bones of the aircraft itself. The wings were solid. The fuselage was intact. Everything that had failed was replaceable. The bomber just needed someone stubborn enough to replace it. The commander asked who would crew this resurrected corpse. The reputation of Old 666 had spread through every squadron. Pilots crossed themselves when they walked past it. Gunners refused assignments to its defensive positions. You couldn't order men to fly a cursed airplane. Zeamer smiled. He had that covered too. The crew that assembled around Old 666 was not selected from the elite. They were selected from the unwanted. Every man who joined Zeamer's project had a reason why no other crew would take him. Joseph Sarnowski was the bombardier. He was older than most aircrew, quiet and intense, with a reputation for perfectionism that bordered on obsession. Other bombardiers thought he was strange. He spent hours calibrating his Norden bomb sight when a few minutes would have satisfied regulations. He insisted on checking and rechecking calculations that other men trusted to luck. Commanders found him difficult because he wouldn't cut corners. The navigator was a man named Reuben "Ruby" Johnston, brilliant with maps and numbers but cursed with a personality that grated on traditional military hierarchy. And the radio operator had been bounced between 3 crews for insubordination. The flight engineer was a mechanical genius who preferred machines to people. The gunners were men who had survived missions that killed their original crewmates, carrying the invisible weight that made other aviators uncomfortable. They called themselves the eager Beavers. Not ironically. They were genuinely eager, hungry for missions that other crews avoided, desperate to prove something to the commanders who had written them off. They were misfits who had found each other, and now they had found an aircraft that matched their reputation perfectly. Old 666 was the plane nobody wanted, crewed by the men nobody wanted. It should have been a formula for disaster. The modification process began in the tropical heat of Port Moresby. Zeamer had a vision that violated every principle of bomber design. Standard B-17S carried 13 machine guns in defensive positions. Zeamer wanted 19. The logic was simple. A bomber's survival depended on its ability to fight off interceptors. More guns meant more bullets in the air. More bullets meant more dead Japanese fighters. The weight penalty was secondary to the firepower advantage. The crew scavenged additional .50 caliber machine guns from wrecked aircraft across the airfield. They mounted twin guns in positions designed for singles. They installed a fixed forward-firing gun in the nose controlled by the pilot, transforming the bomber from a defensive platform into an offensive weapon. They reinforced the mounts, redesigned the ammunition feeds, and created an aircraft that bristled with firepower like a porcupine made of steel. The bombardier's compartment received special attention. Sarnowski insisted on a second gun mount that he could operate while still managing the bomb site. He wanted to fight and aim simultaneously. The standard doctrine said this was impossible. Sarnowski didn't care about standard doctrine. When the work was complete, Old 666 was the most heavily armed bomber in the Pacific Theater. It was also the heaviest, the most fuel-hungry, and the most demanding to fly. The control surfaces strained under the additional weight. The engines worked harder at every altitude. Everything about the aircraft was wrong according to the manual. But the crew didn't fly by the manual. They flew by necessity. June 16, 1943. The mission briefing was brutally simple. Fly to Bougainville. Photograph the Japanese airfields and harbor installations. Return with the intelligence needed to plan the upcoming invasion. The brutal part was the fine print. The mission was solo. No fighter escort, no accompanying bombers. A single aircraft flying deep into enemy territory, holding steady and level for long photography runs over the most heavily defended Japanese base in the Solomon Islands. Every other crew in the 43rd Bomb Group had refused. The mission profile was suicide. Flying straight and level over an enemy airfield was an invitation to concentrated anti-aircraft fire. Flying alone meant no mutual defensive support when the fighters scrambled. Flying a mapping mission meant you couldn't jink or evade. You had to hold your course while the enemy loaded their guns. Zeamer volunteered before the briefing officer finished speaking. Old 666 lifted off in the pre-dawn darkness, climbing slowly under the weight of its extra guns and full fuel tanks. The crew settled into their positions. Zeamer and his co-pilot wrestled with the heavy controls. Sarnowski hunched over his bomb sight in the nose, checking his equipment for the 100th time. The gunners tested their weapons, short bursts into the empty Pacific darkness. The flight to Bougainville took hours. The crew watched the sun rise over an endless expanse of blue water and green islands. The beauty was deceptive. Every island could hide a Japanese observation post. Every cloud could conceal enemy fighters. They were flying deeper into enemy territory with every minute. The target appeared on the horizon just after 6 a.m. Buka and Bougainville, twin islands connected by a narrow strait, home to 5 Japanese airfields and thousands of combat troops. The harbor was full of warships. The sky was full of potential death. Zeamer began the photography run. The bombardier activated the mapping cameras. Old 666 flew straight and level at 25,000 feet, holding course with mechanical precision while the cameras clicked and the crew waited for the inevitable response. The first zero appeared at 8 o'clock low. a silver glint against the dark green jungle. Then another, then 5 more. The radio operator started counting and stopped at 17. The entire Japanese fighter complement at Buka had scrambled. They were climbing toward Old 666 in a loose swarm, spreading out to attack from multiple angles. Zeamer made his decision in an instant. He would not abort. And he would complete the photography run while his crew fought off an entire enemy squadron. It was insane. It was exactly what the eager Beavers had trained for. The first Zero reached firing range and opened up. Tracers lashed past the cockpit. Zeamer held steady. The cameras kept clicking. The bombardier kept calibrating. And the gunners opened fire. 19 machine guns erupted simultaneously. The noise inside Old 666 was indescribable. It was physical pressure, a wall of sound that crushed thought and left only instinct. Spent brass casings rained onto the deck plates like metal hail. Smoke filled every compartment. The aircraft shuddered with the recoil of hundreds of rounds firing per second. The first Zero exploded. It came apart in mid-air, disintegrating into fragments that tumbled past the bomber's wing. And the crew didn't have time to celebrate. Another fighter was already attacking from below. The battle became a blur of fire and blood. Japanese fighters made pass after pass, their 20mm cannons punching holes through Old 666's aluminum skin. The bomber absorbed punishment that would have destroyed a lesser aircraft. Rounds struck the wings, the fuselage, the tail assembly. The cockpit windows shattered. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the flight deck. Zeamer was hit. Shrapnel tore into his arms and legs. Blood pooled beneath his seat. He refused to relinquish the controls. He flew through the pain, through the shock, through the gray edges creeping into his vision. The photography run wasn't complete. He wouldn't leave until it was. In the nose, Sarnosky was fighting his own battle. A cannon round had torn through the bombardier's compartment, destroying equipment and wounding him severely. His left side was shredded. Blood soaked his flight suit. He should have been dead. Instead, he dragged himself back to his gun mount. A Zero was coming in for a frontal attack, trying to kill the pilots through the nose glass. Sarnosky met it with a stream of .50 caliber fire. The Zero staggered, smoke pouring from its engine, and dove away, trailing flames. Another fighter attacked. Sarnosky killed it too. He was dying. He knew he was dying. The blood loss was too severe, but as long as he could lift his arms, he would protect his crew. 45 minutes. That's how long the battle lasted. 45 minutes of continuous combat at 25,000 feet over enemy territory. 45 minutes of machine gun fire and cannon shells and men bleeding and dying in the thin, cold air. The Japanese threw everything they had at Old 666. The bomber threw it back. The 19-gun configuration that experts had mocked as excessive proved to be salvation. Every angle of approach was covered by overlapping fields of fire. Fighters that pressed their attacks too close paid with their lives. When the ammunition finally ran low and the last Zero broke off pursuit, Old 666 was a flying wreck. The airframe was perforated by over 180 bullet holes. 5 crewmen were wounded. The hydraulic system was destroyed. The instruments were shattered. Joseph Sarnosky was dead. He had fought until his body couldn't function any longer, then collapsed over his gun mount. His crewmates found him with his hands still gripping the weapon. Zeamer was barely conscious. His wounds were bleeding faster than the first aid supplies could staunch. The co-pilot took over the controls for the long flight home, nursing the crippled bomber toward Port Moresby with fuel gauges dropping toward empty. Old 666 landed on a single working wheel, skidding down the coral runway in a shower of sparks. The crew counted their dead and their wounded. They counted the holes in their aircraft. They counted the Japanese fighters that would never fly again. The official tally credited the eager Beavers with 5 confirmed kills and 3 probables in a single engagement. Some historians argue the actual number was higher. The chaos of aerial combat made precise counting impossible. What was certain was that one damaged bomber crewed by military misfits had fought 17 enemy fighters to a standstill and completed their mission. Jay Zeamer survived his wounds after months of hospitalization. He and Joseph Sarnosky both received the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration. Sarnosky's was awarded posthumously. Zeamer's made him one of only a handful of bomber pilots in World War II to receive the medal. Old 666 never flew again. The damage was too extensive for repair, but the aircraft had proven something that the brass had refused to believe. A plane was only as good as the men who flew it. A condemned wreck crewed by determined misfits could accomplish what pristine aircraft crewed by conventional thinkers could not. The legacy of Old 666 outlasted the war, and the crew's modifications influenced bomber armament doctrine for years afterward. The willingness to volunteer for impossible missions became a template for special operations thinking. The refusal to accept official condemnation of equipment or personnel proved that military bureaucracy could be wrong about potential. The eager Beavers demonstrated that being unwanted was not the same as being worthless. The misfits who couldn't fit into conventional crews had formed something stronger than conventional units. Their shared status as outcasts had created a bond that held under pressure that would have shattered normal relationships. Sometimes the broken pieces fit together better than the polished ones. Sometimes the cursed becomes the blessed, and sometimes the men who won't follow orders are exactly the men you need when following orders means certain death. The crew of Old 666 flew into history because they refused to accept what everyone told them was true. They refused to believe their plane was cursed. They refused to believe their mission was impossible. They refused to die when dying was the expected outcome. If this story hit you like those 19 machine guns, smash that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Drop a comment below. Would you have climbed aboard a cursed bomber with a crew of misfits for a suicide mission? I'll see you in the next one.